So hi there, I'm Claire Norell. I teach yoga and I facilitate trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga, which is an adjunct treatment, an evidence-based adjunct treatment for complex trauma. And this is Complex Trauma and Body-Centered Healing, Part 2, Neuroplasticity and Trauma in the Brain. Here's another quote from Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, a brain researcher who studies trauma. After trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system. The survivor's energy now becomes focused on suppressing inner chaos at the expense of spontaneous involvement in their life. These attempts to maintain control over unbearable physiological reactions can result in a whole range of physical symptoms, including fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and other autoimmune diseases. And so, as I said at the beginning of the first part of this presentation, I'll say it again with each of the sections, just sometimes learning about trauma in itself can feel overwhelming, especially if you might have some trauma. So during this presentation, maybe just feel aware that, notice how you're feeling as you go through it. Feel welcome to take care of yourself as needed. So that's just a reminder. You might want to stop now and then and check in with yourself. You could take a break and come back to it later, or do what you need to do. And then before going on, you might take a moment or two here to notice your breathing, if that's something you like to do. Maybe stretch your body a little bit. Maybe just notice how you're feeling in your body. Might feel your feet on the ground and see if you can find a fairly comfortable way to be positioned as you go through this presentation. And then whenever you feel ready, you can go on. So, neuroplasticity in trauma and healing. Neuroplasticity is the way that your nervous system changes in response to the experiences that you have. It's the way that your body and mind adapt and learn. And here's a quote from my friend Leora Weissman, who is a massage therapist, educator, and yoga teacher. She wrote, "The neural pathways we use the most become our automatic defaults. In electrical terms, they are literally the path of least resistance. Think of them as ruts carved into our brains by what we do over and over." I think that's just really good description of neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is thoughts and experiences creating new neural pathways. And neural pathways are connections between nerve cells that allow signals to travel from one area of your body to another. To help us survive, memories of harm and how to avoid it create the strongest neural pathways. Repetition strengthens neural pathways, while neural pathways that are used less weaken. And that's related to neural pruning, which is the way that pathways that aren't being used will just go away. Your nervous system registers the danger of traumatic experiences and engraves sensations associated with them in implicit or procedural memory. So nonverbal thoughts, procedures, habits that are stored in lower unconscious parts of your brain. So kind of like learning to ride a bike is one example that's used often. Things that you can do without having to think about it. Trauma is a part of that. All the set of trauma symptoms and trauma reactions are it's a set of habits that becomes engraved in procedural memory. Sounds, tastes, smells, images, touch, and internal sensations like hunger, tiredness, loneliness, arousal, anger, even gentleness can become intertwined with feelings of danger or harm. So if in the original traumatic experience there was some combination where those things were connected, then they can stay connected in your procedural memory. Sometimes trauma may intensify sensations that are associated with danger, and sometimes it may diminish them or even shut them down. And there are studies looking at this. Wendy D'Andrea is one of the researchers listed at the end of this presentation who has studied this. In trauma, to focus on immediate survival, many areas of the nervous system may shut down. Trauma can temporarily impair or shut down logic, sequencing, and verbal expression. And the left side of the brain in general becomes somewhat less active during a traumatic experience, but then also in a triggered trauma reaction. It can be in brain scans. They can see these areas that become less active and other areas that become more active. So the left side of the brain tends to become less active in a trauma reaction, including Broca's area, which is associated with verbal expression. And this is related to why it can be very difficult or even impossible to access words and language to describe some aspects of traumatic experiences, because that part in the original experience, that part may have been shut down. It can temporarily impair or shut down executive reasoning, social connection in the mirror neurons in your brain, and this is in the medial prefrontal cortex, tends to become less active in a trauma reaction. Sense of time, often for many people in trauma or in a trauma reaction, the ability to feel time passing, and that's in your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Filtering, the ability to discern what's important and what isn't. And focus, the ability to learn new things. And both of these are associated with the thalamus, which also can become less active in a trauma response. And the ability to integrate information into long-term memory in your hippocampus. And actually the hippocampus, the size of the hippocampus can be affected by trauma. They found that people with trauma tend to have a smaller hippocampus, but they've also found that with treatment and healing, the size of a person's hippocampus can actually become larger again. As I recall, this has to do with neuroplasticity, properties of neuroplasticity, making an area more active and larger, as I recall, with the hippocampus. Okay. So the ability to self-soothe and be calm is another area that can be temporarily impaired or shut down. And that's your upper parasympathetic nervous system, the ventral vagal complex, and your upper body. We talked about in the first presentation. And certain physical senses. So sometimes the ability to see, hear, smell, feel, or taste things that are in some way associated with the trauma. And again, Wendy Adondria is one person who's studied that. There's been a number of studies looking at that. Trauma can temporarily impair or shut down the interoceptive pathways which bring body sensations to your insula in your midbrain. I believe it's called your midbrain, the center of your brain, where they're processed to create a sense of self. So it's the sense of here I am, alive in the world. And when these areas are affected by trauma, it can actually diminish your sense of connection with your full physical and emotional self. And so that's one of the things we work with in healing from trauma, is to reactivate the interoceptive pathways. Meanwhile, trauma makes other parts of the nervous system more active, for example, the right side of your brain, and which can make it that a person's body feels as if traumatic events from the past are happening in the present moment. Also, the threat perception system can become very active, especially the amygdala, which means that danger may be perceived whether or not it's currently present. And finally, the sympathetic nervous system and HPA axis can also become chronically activated, with cortisol levels going up quickly and then coming down slowly. So a lot of cortisol in your system, which, as we looked at also earlier, in the short term, cortisol creates energy for a fight or flight response to protect yourself and activate to take care of yourself. But in the long term, cortisol harms focus, memory, the immune system, and sleep, among other things. So with chronic stress, all of those functions can become impaired or harmed. With trauma, neuroplasticity makes your nervous system focus on detecting and avoiding the dangers of the past. But often trauma reactions do not protect you from harm in current circumstances, and they do keep you from being fully present and aware in the moment. Fortunately, neuroplasticity also means that at any age, they're finding, your nervous system can learn new habits of resilience and recovery. So trauma is not about personal weakness, a lack of willpower, or having the wrong attitude. It's about the ways that your nervous system develops deep, unconscious habits meant to protect you after overwhelmingly harmful experiences. Yet over time, trauma itself harms physical and emotional health, and this is why people study and develop ways to heal from it. So, as I said at the end of part 1 in this series of presentations, thank you for being interested in this. If you'd like to share this presentation with other people, you're welcome to do that. Please just acknowledge the sources, me and others, and certainly others, out of respect for the work involved. So, especially you might acknowledge these people. This presentation is based on the work of David Emerson, Bud Craig, Stephen Porges, Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, Elaine Miller-Karas, Pat Ogden, Dan Siegel, Ruth Lanius, Ron Siegel, Ruth Businski, Peter Levine, Bessel van der Kolk, and Wendy D'Andrea. Those are trauma researchers. And then also yoga teacher trainers Marlisa Sullivan and Hala Khoury. Thank you to all of these people for their work supporting trauma prevention and healing. And again, thank you for watching these presentations.